Question number 12, Kevin Hague.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Conservation and asks, what percentage of forest in Northland currently has multi-pest control operations by the Department of Conservation?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Maggie Barry.
Mr. Speaker, DOC is responsible for 40% of the Northland forests. DOC administers therefore 104,000 hectares of forests in Northland. Approximately 60% of this is under some form of sustained pest control. We spend $3.19 million on multi-pest control in Northland, and if you add what we use in weed control, which is a big problem because it smothers all the native seedlings, the total is $5.87 million each and every year.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Kevin Hague.
Mr. Speaker, this was a question on notice, and while that was a detailed answer, it didn't actually address the question. So the question asked what percentage of the forest was the subject of multi-pest control. The minister told us what the budget was for multi-pest control and what proportion of the estate had some form of pest control, but did not answer the point that was in the question.
Order. I didn't listen in detail to the Minister's answer.
I did.
Order. I'm on my feet. I think, in fact, the question has been answered, but the way forward is I will give the member now an additional supplementary question and he can delve into the answer was given and hopefully get more information to his satisfaction. Kevin Hague, supplementary question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. So in light of that answer, Minister, what is the number of hectares in Northland that is currently the subject of multi-pest control by the Department of Conservation?
The Honourable Maggie Barry.
Mr. Speaker, for the purposes of clarity, I will spell out again. DOC is responsible for 40% of the forests in Northland. That accounts for 270,000 hectares. So DOC administers 104,000 hectares, of which 60% is under some form of sustained pest control. And I'll give you the numbers again if you like.
Order. Order.
I've given you a brief.
Order. Yeah. I'd be grateful without the assistance of the interjection to my left. Supplementary question, Kevin Hague.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. How, in Conservation Week, does she explain why large areas of kiwi habitat forest in Russell, Otangaroa and Whangaroa have been reduced to sticks because of possum damage that has occurred on her watch?
The Honourable Maggie Barry.
Mr. Speaker, the only good possum is a dead possum. We do a great deal to control possums because they are the ones, the browsers, that destroy the canopy. So when you look at the way in which we increase our spending and how that protects the kiwi, there are a number of ways of measuring it. So with 102,000 hectares of sustained stoke control undertaken by DOC and community organisations as well, kiwi numbers, it may interest the member to know, are increasing by 2.8% per year across the whole of Northland.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Kevin Hague.
How does reducing the budget for natural heritage protection by $7 million, as in Budget 2015, contribute to Conservation Week's aim of getting New Zealanders out to enjoy nature?
The Honourable Maggie Barry.
Mr. Speaker, DOC's natural heritage management budget has in fact stayed the way it has been. The member is pointing out an accountancy practice, which is that $6 million has been carried over. So if you want to know the reason for the shortfall, it is usually to do with weather conditions, it is to do with other acts of nature which mean that we are not able to spend that amount each year, but that is carried over until the following year. There is no reduction in spending.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Kevin Hague.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister consider it sufficient to increase multi-pest control by just 50,000 hectares a year when at least 1 million hectares of Indigenous forest is needed to achieve a predator-free New Zealand?
Speaker.
The Honourable Maggie Barry.
DOC takes the pest control issue very seriously, and it would be most helpful if that party and that member stood up and actually made the point that 1080 is an essential ingredient in pest control, and we do this all the time. We have to increase our methods of using 1080. We have just in fact done a drop a couple of weeks ago. It is the first time that DOC has been able to work collaboratively with Te Raroa, and we have put 6,000 hectares of conservation land forest in these extremely steep, hard to reach places treated with aerial 1080, and a further 6,500 hectares of private land surrounding Warra Warra, which, as the member may or may not know, is extremely steep country, unable to be trapped and poisoned in traditional methods, and that is treated with support from the Regional Council and with iwi. So in terms of what DOC is doing with 1080 aerial use, we are doing our very best to get the possum numbers under control, because that's what needs to happen in Northland.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Kevin Hague.
Mr. Speaker, the question was whether 50,000 hectares a year increase was sufficient in the light of 1 million hectares nationally being required for Indigenous forest multi-pest control. Again, Mr. Speaker, it was a lengthy answer with a lot of detail about 1080 use in Northland, but it didn't address the question I asked.
And the difficulty is the question that was asked, which was not a straight question. It again was a lengthy question. And if the member wants to look at Speaker's ruling 1957, when the member asks a question that seeks an opinion, members cannot expect a precise answer. A straight question would be helpful.
Yeah, thank
Further
you, Mr.
supplementary?
Speaker. Supplementary. Yeah.
Supplementary question, Kevin Hague.
Is it acceptable on her watch for more species in the north, such as kōkako and kiwi, to follow the kākariki, which is now extinct north of Kawakawa because of inadequate pest control?
The Honourable Maggie Barry.
I can reassure the member and all other members of this House that as the Minister of Conservation, I take very seriously indeed pest control. If we want to avoid silent forests, we need to use pest control and we need to use 1080 aerial drops, and that's what we are doing. DOC has 6 regions throughout the country. The Northland region is one of them. It gets 17.6 of our natural heritage spending, so more than other regions. We take it seriously. We are trying to convince iwi and other people who are 1080 sceptics that it is a very useful tool. The more we can use it, the more effective we can be in getting rid of the possums, the rats, the stoats and the other creatures that are predating on our birds and killing them. This is not something I want to have happen on my watch or indeed in the history of this country.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Given the very high unemployment levels in Northland, why haven't the unemployed been enlisted in pest control operations against possums?
The Honourable Maggie Barry.
The unemployed in their various ways can choose the way they want to spend their time, and if they want to go out and trap possums, I would be very, very pleased to hear it. Once again, if this member is suggesting for one moment that we are going to be able to resolve the pest problem in Northland by letting a few people who are out of work go out and do some trapping, that member is delusional, because it is not possible to do that.
Order. Point of order, and it will be order. It will be order. This point of order will be heard in silence.
Respect. I am asking the Minister a serious questions as one of the alternative members, means of pest control, and the last thing I want is an abuse from her, and nor will I take it.
Order. 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 Order on this occasion. Order. On this occasion, I think the member is quite right. The last part of that answer was completely unnecessary to the question. The first part of the answer addressed the question to my satisfaction, maybe not to the members, but certainly the last remark was completely unnecessary. That concludes questions for oral answer. I call on Government Order of the Day